Hello, everyone. How are you all tonight? Happy May. Welcome to the ultimate event of the 2016-2017 Inprint Margaret Root Brown Reading Series. I've always wanted to say that. I'm Rich Levy, Executive Director of Inprint, Houston's intrepid nonprofit literary arts organization, and we're glad you're here. In 36 seasons, this series has presented more than 375 great writers from 28 countries, including winners of 8 Nobel Prizes, 62 Pulitzers, 56 National Book Awards, as well as 17 U.S. Poets Laureate. This year has been a particularly great season, and we must thank you all for it, and making it joyous and possible. And also my heartfelt thanks to the Inprint staff. They are a small group of hardworking, smart, dedicated colleagues. It's a team effort, so thanks to all. I appreciate it. Thank you. Tonight, we're thrilled to welcome to Houston and to the series the wonderful Irish writer Colm Tóibín, reading from his brand new novel, House of Names. We have been hoping to present Colm for many years, and we're glad to do it now on the eve of the launch of this wonderful new book. And we're also grateful to Colm for visiting the High School for the Performing and Visual Arts this afternoon. And regarding next season, 2017-2018, it's getting very close to 2020, which sounds kind of science fiction-y. Anyway, as always, we have many great evenings in store for you, and we'll be unfurling the roster via a storm of tweets this summer. So stay tuned to the Twitter feed. Krupa has a plan. The Inprint Writers Workshops start in a few weeks. There's still a few open spots. The Inprint Book Club will be discussing Lincoln in the Bardo this Sunday. Come on over to Imprint House for that. And House of Names on June 11th. So for all the details, many cool links, videos of past readings, visit imprinthouston.org, where you can also join the email list and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. The Inprint Margaret Root Brown Reading Series is presented by Inprint in association with Brazos Bookstore and the University of Houston Creative Writing Program. This series is made possible by the generous support of the Brown Foundation, named for one of its founding trustees, Margaret Root Brown. Also underwritten by Weatherford International and the National Endowment for the Arts, which is happily still with us and affirms that art works. Yay. We owe big thanks to Houston Public Media, MM Properties, and Wind Park for their in-kind support. Inprint receives funding from the City of Houston through the Houston Arts Alliance and from the Texas Commission on the Arts. And thank you to our season ticket buyers. Now tonight we are live streaming this reading in collaboration with our friends at Houston Public Media. Nothing compares to the real thing. But if you know folks who can't be with us, please let them know. They can join us from anywhere in the world via the live stream, which is available at imprinthouston.org or at houstonpublicmedia.org/imprint. And then in the near future, the live stream will be on the Inprint website in our archive of readings as on-demand video. So after the reading tonight, Colm will have a conversation with novelist and UH Honors Professor Robert Crimmins, Honors Program Professor, a fellow Irishman. Watch out. Then we will move to the lobby for a book sale and signing. You are fortunate the rest of the country must wait until tomorrow. But Scribner's has given us dispensation for Brazos Bookstore to sell House of Names tonight. Brazos has signed copies for your convenience and offers discounts to Inprint patrons. Finally, please set your cell phones on stun or silent mode. Thank you. What to say about Colm Tóibín, whose novel seems carved from stone, etched with clarity, keen observation, and hard-won wisdom? Here are a few thoughts to supplement the bio sketch in your programs. In 2015, Tóibín published a wonderful small book called On Elizabeth Bishop, about the great poet and her work. And he wrote, in certain societies, including where I am from, Language was neither ornament nor exaltation. It was firm and austere in its purpose. Our time on earth did not give us cause or need to say anything more than was necessary. Language was thus a form of calm, modest knowledge, or maybe evasion. The poetry and the novels and stories written in the light of this knowledge or evasion had to be led by clarity, briskness of feeling, no open displays of anything, least of all easy feeling. The tone implied an acceptance of what was known. The music or the power was in what was often left out. The smallest word or the holding of breath could have a fierce, stony power. The same could be said of House of Names. Perhaps this emanates from the nature of the source material, the tragedies of Sophocles, Euripides, and Aeschylus. As Allison Ward, Houston Chronicle book editor, put it in her review and interview in yesterday's paper, House of Names is an ancient Greek story of palace intrigue, but it feels as fresh as newly spilled blood. Perfect. A few facts about Colm Tóibín you might not know, thanks to the New York Times. He's born in Enniscorthy, Wexford, Ireland. Couldn't read until age 9 and then rapidly made up for time. As a teen, he tells of disturbing the folks more when I became addicted to poetry, and as a teenager learned Sylvia Plath's Daddy by heart. And Hamlet, he says, is essential to who he is today. Reading it at 15, quote, gave me permission to mourn my father's death, to make smart remarks to teachers, to make fun of my betters, to procrastinate, to keep my best lines for my conversations with myself, to enjoy the theater, to do whatever I please, to view all forms of authority with sourness. His favorite fictional hero is Leopold Bloom from Joyce's Ulysses. His favorite villain is Edward Casaubon from George Eliot's Middlemarch, whom he says is given a raw deal in the book. Readers like to dislike him, but the older I get, the more sympathy I have for him as he tries to finish an unfinishable book and then is brave enough to marry a young woman who could not have been a bundle of laughs. What a privilege for us to have him here today. Please give a warm-spirited Houston welcome to this extraordinary writer who understands the subtle movements of the human heart, Colm Tóibín.
This novel, is this working? Yeah. This novel is a retelling of the story that's already told in the Orestes and in plays also by Sophocles and Euripides. However, there's a late play by Euripides, and it was as though at the end of his life, old Euripides realized that all of them had given poor Clytemnestra, the mother of Electra, the wife of Agamemnon, a bad press. That she doesn't get the best lines, her daughter gets the best lines, she doesn't get to lead an army, her husband gets to lead an army, and of course gets murdered, as we know, by her own son, Orestes. So generally she has pretty bad luck, and Euripides decided at the end of his life to see if he could rectify that. So he writes this extraordinary play called Iphigenia in Aulis, where he tells the story from her side. That there she was, her husband had gone to war, and he was waiting for the winds to change, and he asked the gods, or his people asked the gods what to do, and the gods said, the winds will change, but they'll only change if you are prepared to sacrifice your beautiful daughter Iphigenia, and then the winds will change. And in my version of the story, what happens then really represents a sort of weakness on Agamemnon's part. He may be heroic in other versions, but I think if you're writing a contemporary novel, a hero is no use. You're always looking for the flaws in the hero, for the thing that's wrong in each person who seems to be perfect. In him, this moment, he realizes it's the last thing in the world he wants to do. And of course, his men, the people who are in his army, say, you have to do it. and he sways between what he knows he should do, which is not do it, and what he knows he must do, which is do it. So he gets in touch eventually with his wife, Clytemnestra, and says, can you bring Iphigenia with you? And bring Orestes, who's our son, who's about 8 as well. There's going to be a wedding. Iphigenia is going to marry the warrior Achilles. It's going to be a great occasion. And his wife is lured, therefore, to the battlefield, or to the camp, rather. And they get seamstresses before they go, and they get all the wedding clothes ready, and they're absolutely prepared for this great feast that's going to occur. And even when she meets him, and in my version, the reader watches as he just, obviously, you can see he cannot tell her. She's all ready. She's fired up for the wedding. And the boy is sword fighting with his father, and Iphigenia, she says it's a pure picture of happiness to see the son reunited with his father. The son wants to be a warrior too, to see the daughter beautiful beside her father. Everything is ready for the wedding. And it's only the next day when she meets Achilles and says, well, you're the man who's going to marry my daughter. Achilles says, what? No. What? No. And she says, of course you are. And he says, do you not know, do you really not know what's going to happen? And she didn't. And he almost doesn't tell her. And then someone tells her daughter. And so then over days, she tries to do anything she can to stop this happening. She pleads with her husband. She gets her daughter to do so. And but she watches her husband's weakness and realizes that he will be swayed by these other men who he's with, and not by her, and not by doing what's right. And then she plots everything to see if there's any chance that she can actually still stop the event. And what happens then, of course, is that in my version, again, he has to get rid of her, so he just simply buries her underground for 3 days, regularly just throwing down water on top of her just to further and disturb her, make her show her who's in power. The winds change, and when the winds change, he goes to battle, sending her and her son Orestes back home without Iphigenia, who has been sacrificed. And of course, in going home with this shock, she fails to deal with her daughter Electra. She fails to tell her exactly what's happened. And thus Electra becomes her enemy, thinking that somehow or other Electra owes loyalty to her father rather than her mother. And thus the story begins, the spiral of killings begins. And she decides that once her husband finally comes back victorious from the war, that she will murder him. And in order to murder him, she needs to get a lover or somebody who will help her. She gets Aegisthus, who's been an old enemy of her husband's. And so she prepares in the way she feels the last time she was fooled. This time she will not be fooled. This time she will be ready and waiting. She will have plotted every moment. And she will get him at that moment, I think, when a man feels most vulnerable, which is if you have one foot in the bath and the other foot not in the bath. You're in an oddly sort of vulnerable position. And if anybody wanted to do anything to you, it'd be a good moment for that. And so she does that. And so in this first bit I want to read, this is her before she realizes what losing her daughter's, Electra's confidence is going to mean to her. And when she's in the aftermath of killing her husband, when she's thinking about what she did. I've been acquainted with the smell of death, the sickly, sugary smell that wafted in the wind towards the rooms in this palace. It is easy now for me to feel peaceful and content. I spend my morning looking at the sky and the changing light. The bird song begins to rise as the world fills with its own pleasures, and then, as the day wanes, the sound too wanes and fades. I watch as the shadows lengthen. So much has slipped away, but the smell of death lingers. Maybe the smell has entered my body and been welcomed there like an old friend come to visit. The smell of fear and panic. The smell is here like the very air is here. It returns in the same way as light in the morning returns. It is my constant companion. It has put life into my eyes, eyes that grew dull with waiting, but are not dull now. Eyes that are alive now with brightness. I gave orders that the bodies should remain in the open until the sun a day or two, under the sun a day or two, until the sweetness gave way to stench. And I liked the flies that came, the little bodies perplexed and brave, buzzing after their feast, upset by the continuing hunger they felt in themselves, a hunger I had come to know too, had come to appreciate. We are all hungry now. Food merely whets our appetite, it sharpens our teeth. Meat makes us ravenous for more meat, as death is ravenous for more death. Murder makes us ravenous, fills the soul with satisfaction that is fierce and then luscious enough to create a taste for further satisfaction. A knife piercing the soft flesh under the ear with intimacy and precision, and then moving across the throat as soundlessly as the sun moves across the sky, but with greater speed and zeal, and then his dark blood flowing with the same inevitable hush as dark night falls on familiar things. And she starts to think about the whole idea of what is governing everything. And it's one of the problems I think that you have as a novelist now, dealing with this material, is that so much of the Greek plays and the Greek myths depend on an idea about the gods that is very difficult to register in a novel. If you think about it in, say, Jane Austen novel, can you imagine if she'd suddenly said, God came down and organised a wedding between Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth? You know, even with George Eliot, or imagine with Henry James saying, it was God. Isabel Archer prayed very hard one night, and God told her she should marry Gilbert Osmond. And you think, no, something else happened. And the novel, the strange thing about the novel, I mean, there are exceptions to this, but that the novel is more than anything a secular space. It's a space freed of the gods or the power of the gods. Although people can pray in novels, much more they're much happier in a way thinking about money than thinking about divinity. Thinking about love or lost love or food or what their desires really are or betraying each other. But it's very difficult in a novel to have a character going to confession, for example, and getting full, even if you have a Catholic character. You have to somewhere or other allow, I mean, despite Graham Greene's best efforts, to allow sort of sin to be something human and mortal rather than something that offends God, something that offends people. And in other words, we have to allow our characters in novels choices and chances. We have to allow them to make their own destiny. If we suddenly say all the time, no matter what happened, that Clytemnestra prayed to the gods and the gods gave her what she wanted, you just say, well, why should I care about Clytemnestra? Why don't you write a novel about the gods, since they're the ones who seemingly have all the power in this? And so I had to do something quite urgent and necessary in the book in order to get these gods. I mean, I'm sure they were wonderful in their own way. And I wouldn't, I mean, if they're listening now, I still believe in you. I mean, there was a woman in Ireland was asked if she believed in fairies, and she said, oh, no, I don't believe in them, but they're there. And so it's the same idea with this. So she's talking about the whole, like, what I have to have her do is move into a secular space for the purposes of the novel, so the novel can proceed. Her husband has been using the gods, but there's no sense either that he believes in them either, other than, you know, since he has, with his men, asked the gods for help, and the word has come, he must sacrifice his daughter, then he does. I had spies to tell me when he being Agamemnon, when he would come back. Men lit each fire that gave the news to further hills where other men lit fires to alert me. It was the fire that brought the news, not the gods. Among the gods now, there is no one who offers me assistance or oversees my actions or knows my mind. There is no one among the gods to whom I appeal. I live alone in the shivering, solitary knowledge that the time of the gods has passed. I'm praying to no gods. I'm alone among those here because I do not pray and will not pray again. Instead, I will speak in ordinary whispers. I will speak in words that come from the world. And those words will be filled with regret for what has been lost. I will make sounds like prayers, but prayers that have no source and no destination, not even a human one, since my daughter is dead and cannot hear. I know, as no one else knows, that the gods are distant. They have other concerns. They care about human desires and antics in the same way that I care about the leaves of a tree. I know the leaves are there. They wither and grow again and wither as people come and live and then are replaced by others like them. There's nothing I can do to help them or prevent their withering. I do not deal with their desires. I wish now to stand here and laugh, hear me tittering and then howling with mirth at the idea that the gods allowed my husband to win his war, that they inspired every plan he worked out and every move he made, that they knew his cloudy moods in the morning and the strange and silly exhilaration he could exude at night, that they listened to his implorings and discussed them in their godly home, that they watched the murder of my daughter with approval. The bargain was simple, or so he believed, or so his troops believed. Kill the innocent girl in return for a change in the wind. Take her out of the world. Use a knife on her flesh to ensure that she would never again walk into a room or wake in the morning. Deprive the world of her grace. And as a reward, the gods would make the wind blow in her father's favour on the day he needed winds for his sails. They would hush the wind on the other days when his enemies needed it. The gods would make his men alert and brave and fill his enemies with fear. The gods would strengthen his swords and make them swift and sharp. When he was alive, he and his men around him believed that the gods followed their fates and cared about them, each of them. But I will say now that they did not, they do not. Our appeal to the gods is the same as the appeal a star makes in the sky above us before it falls. It is a sound we cannot hear, a sound to which even if we did hear it, we would be fully indifferent. The gods have their own unearthly concerns, unimagined by us. They barely know we are alive. For them, if they were to hear of us, we would be like the mild sound of wind in the trees, a distant, unpersistent, rustling sound. I know that it was not always thus. There was a time when the gods came in the morning to wake us, when they combed our hair and filled our mouths with the sweetness of speech and listened to our desires and tried to fulfill them for us, when they knew our minds, when they could send us signs. Not long ago, within our memories, the crying women could be heard in the night and the time before death came. It was a way of calling the dying home, hastening their flight, softening their wavering journey to the place of rest. My husband was with me in the days before my mother died, and we both heard it, and my mother heard it too, and it comforted her that death was ready to lure her with its cries. That noise has stopped. There is no more crying like the wind. The dead fade in their own time. No one helps them. No one notices except those who have been close to them during their short spell in the world. As they fade from the earth, the gods do not hover over with their haunting whistling sound. I notice it here, the silence around death. They have departed, the ones who oversaw death. They have gone and they will not be back. My husband was lucky with the wind, that was all. And lucky his men were brave, and lucky that he prevailed. It could easily have been otherwise. He did not need to sacrifice our daughter to the gods. My nurse was with me from the time I was born. In her last days, we did not believe that she was dying. I sat with her and we talked. If there had been the slightest sound of wailing, we would have heard. There was nothing, no sound to accompany her towards death. There was silence or the usual noises from the kitchen or the barking of dogs. Then she died. Then she stopped breathing. It was over for us. I went out and looked at the sky. And all I had then to help me was the leftover language of prayer. What had once been powerful and added meaning to everything was now desolate, strange, with its own sad, brittle power, with its memory locked in its rhythms of a vivid past when our world rose up and found completion. Now our words are trapped in time. They are filled with limits. They are mere distractions. They are as fleeting and monotonous as breath. They keep us alive. And maybe that is something, at least for the moment, for which we should be grateful. There is nothing else. And she goes back over in the same way as anyone who's been through anything traumatized, who's been traumatized, goes back over exactly what happened when she went to that place and when her daughter was sacrificed. This is this is the moment when it begins. In the distance, we could hear the howls of the animals that had been brought to the place of sacrifice. I demanded that all the women who had once more had arrived get out of our sight, except the few we trusted who had accompanied us to the camp. I ordered Iphigenia's wedding clothes to be prepared and the clothes I had planned to wear at the wedding ceremony to be laid out for me. I asked for water so we could bathe, and then special white ointment for our faces and black lines for around our eyes, so that we would seem pale and unearthly as we made our way to that place of death. At first no one spoke. Then the silence was broken at intervals by men shouting, by the sound of prayers rising, by animals bellowing and letting out fierce shrieks. When word came that there were men outside and they were preparing to enter, I went towards the opening of the tent. The men seemed frightened when they saw me. "Do you know who I am?" I asked. They would not look at me or reply. "Are you too cowardly to speak?" I asked. "We are not," one of them said. "Do you know who I am?" I asked this man. "Yes," he said. "From my mother I received a set of words that she in turn had received from hers," I said. "These words have been sparingly used. They cause the insides of all men within earshot to shrivel, and then the insides of all their children. Only their wives are spared, and they are destined then to search the dust for food to peck." They were so filled with superstition, I saw, that any set of words that invoked the gods or an ancient curse would install fear in them. Not one of them questioned me, even with a glance. Not one shadow passed over what I had said, not one hint that there was no such curse, and never had been. "If one of you lays a finger on my daughter, or on me," I continued, "if one of you walks ahead of us or speaks, I will invoke that curse. Unless you come behind us like a pack of dogs, I will speak the words of that curse." Each one of them looked chastened. Arguments would not work for them, not even pity. But the slightest invocation of a power beyond their power had them spellbound. Had they looked up again, they would have seen a smile of pure contempt pass across my face. Inside, Iphigenia was ready, like some deeply moulded version of herself, stately, placid, not responding to the sound of an animal howling in pain that rose at the very place where she soon would see the light for the last time. I whispered to her, they are frightened of our curses. Wait until there is silence and raise your voice. Explain how ancient the curse is, passed from mother to daughter over time, and how seldom it has been used because of its power. Threaten to invoke it unless they relent. Threaten it first against your father and then against each one of them, beginning with those closest to you. Warn them that there will be no army left at all, just dogs growling in the deathly stillness that your curse will leave behind. I told her then what the words of the curse should say. We walked in ceremony from our tent to the killing place, Iphigenia first, with me some distance behind her, and then the women who had come with us, and then the soldiers. The day was hot. The smell of the blood and the innards of animals and the aftermath of fear and butchering came towards us until it took all our will not to cover our noses from the stench. Instead of a place of dignity, they had made the place where the killing was to happen into a ramshackle site, with soldiers wandering around aimlessly, and the leftover parts of dead animals strewn about. Perhaps it was this scene, coupled with how easy it had been to invoke the gods in the curse I had invented, that sharpened something already in me. As we walked towards the place of slaughter, I realized for the first time that I was sure, fully sure, that I did not believe at all in the power of the gods. I wondered if I was alone in this. I wondered if Agamemnon and the men around him really cared about the gods, if they really believed that a hidden power beyond their power was holding the troops in a spell that no mortal power could manage to cast. But of course they did. Of course they were sure of what they believed, enough for them to want to go through with this plan. As we approached Agamemnon, he whispered to his daughter, "Your name will be remembered forever." He turned to me, and in a voice of gravity and self-importance, he whispered, "Her name will be remembered forever." I saw now that one of the soldiers who had accompanied us went to an Agamemnon and whispered something to him. Agamemnon listened closely and then spoke quietly, firmly to the 5 or 6 men around him. Then the chanting began, the calling out to the gods in phrases filled with repetitions and strange inversions. I closed my eyes and listened. I could smell the blood of the animals as it began to sour, and there were vultures in the sky, so it was all death. and then the single sound of the chant followed by the rippling, rising sound of the chant being repeated by those who follow the gods most closely, and then a sudden mass sound directed towards the sky as thousands of men responded with one voice. I looked at Iphigenia as she stood alone. She exuded an unearthly power with the beauty of her robes, the whiteness of her face, the blackness of her hair, the black lines around her eyes, her stillness and silence. The figure who seems most mysterious in all of these plays is the figure of Orestes. Orestes, so there's Agamemnon, Clytemnestra, their two daughters, Iphigenia, who's to be sacrificed, Electra, who's in a rage with her mother, and then the strange boy, Orestes, who has been away. We really, his serious scholars, I'm just a novelist, but serious scholars have, where was he? He has to return. Electra in the plays is always waiting for the return of my brother. And he leaves the lock of his hair on the grave, and she doesn't recognize him first. Where has he been? Where would such a boy be held or kept? And I had to imagine this, because since there's no evidence for it, it almost was a gift to me, where so much of the other material has been fully dramatized. This was not dramatized. This was there to be not reimagined, but imagined for the first time. And so in this novel, Orestes, at the time of when his mother is planning to murder his father, she agrees that he should be taken away so he won't witness this. And in fact, he's kidnapped and taken away to a place where other boys who've been kidnapped are being held. And just before they're all to be released, he and two other boys escape. And they cross the countryside over the mountains in Greece, and they actually come to a place where they're looked after over a period of something like 10 years, as in a sort of folk tale, by an old woman who looks after them, and they look after her. But when it comes to the old woman's death, one of their friends dies as well, and they realize finally that it's time for them to go. They promised the old woman they would stay with her and guard her until she died, because they've killed her dogs that are already guarding her. With the dogs dead, she's no one to guard her. And they say, we will be your guard. But now that she's dead, they are not needed, and they can go home. But of course, home for them now is a distant place, not just in terms of the distance to walk, but distance in time. And as they're getting ready to leave, Leander, who's a sort of leader, in other words, Orestes is very much the younger brother, the one who's very easily led, the one who's always looking for a hero or a leader. He will be bullied eventually by his sister, Electra, into murdering his mother, as he will be led here by Leander, who will make all the decisions. And so they start talking about home, about the idea of going home. And one of the things that's happened is that although Orestes' two friends know that his mother murdered his father, they don't want to tell him this. It's just too much. So they don't even want to tell him about his father. They just evade the question. So over these years, he just wonders who is left at home. He knows something happened at home. He's been told that his father is dead, but he's no idea who else is there or what else is happening. So Leander talks. I want to see my grandfather if he's still alive. He had two sons, but one of them died, and then my father had only one son, and that is me. Maybe my grandfather is waiting for me. Ianthe, my sister, was 10 when I was taken. She's a woman now, and she's waiting for me too, and my father and my mother are waiting for me, my uncles and aunts and my other grandparents, the parents of my mother. And then Orestes talks. I don't know who is waiting for me. Maybe that's what Mitros was trying to say, that there is no one waiting for me. Your mother is waiting for you, and Electra too, Leander said. But not my father. Your father is dead. Who killed him? Leander did not reply for a moment, and then holding Orestes closer, he whispered, It is enough that he is dead. My sister Iphigenia is dead too, Orestes said. I know, Leander said. I saw her dying. Orestes said. None of them knew that I saw her dying, and I heard her voice, and I heard my mother screaming, and I saw her being dragged away. How did you see this? And so this is the boy Orestes who has come to the wedding of his sister with his mother. And he's so interested in sword fighting and being his father's son that he's always finding a soldier to go sword fighting with. His father has a new sword made for him. And of course, the last thing his mother thinks about as she, in that scene I've just read, where she sort of, as it were, orchestrates or does a sort of choreography for the killing of her daughter, that Orestes actually is watching, that he can see what's happening. She presumes that he has been taken away by soldiers, so he will not witness the killing of his sister. But in fact he does. This is Orestes' version of what happened. I was on the hill in the camp. They'd left me to play sword fighting with the soldiers, but the soldiers grew tired of the game after a time, and then I was alone in one of the tents, and I fell asleep and woke up to the sound of animals howling, and I went out of the tent and lay on the ground overlooking where the heifers were being brought in, and I watched as they were slaughtered. I heard the sound they made, the frightened sound that came from their bellies, and then I saw blood spurting, and my father was there and other men that I knew. I could smell the blood of the animals and the entrails that were everywhere, streaming everywhere. I was going to run down to my father or maybe find my mother or Iphigenia. But then I saw them. They were in a procession at the front of the procession. Iphigenia and my mother were both ahead of all the others, and there were men behind them. There was not a sound when they appeared. I saw them cutting my sister's hair. Then they made her kneel. Her hands and her feet were tied, and then I heard her voice and my mother's. And they put something over their mouths to stop them shouting, and the men dragged my mother away. And then my sister tried to reach my father, but she was dragged back. Then they put a blindfold on her. And then another man who was beside my father moved slowly towards her with a knife in his hand. And the cloth around her mouth fell away, and she started to scream. The sound was like an animal. She fell over, and they took her body away. And what happened then? Leander asked. Then I went back into the tent, and I lay down and waited. Some men came and asked me if I wanted to play sword fighting, but I told them I'd played enough. Then my father came, and he played with me and carried me on his shoulders through the camp. And where was your mother? I was with my father's men. I must have slept in his tent for a few nights, because I remember all of them talking and then the shouting when they knew the ships could finally sail, because the wind had changed. Men were rushing everywhere once the wind changed. They almost forgot about me until Achilles saw me and brought me to my father. And then my father carried me on his shoulders again through the camp to where my mother was. And then we began the journey back. Did you tell your mother what you saw? I wondered at first if she knew that Iphigenia was dead, or if she might ask me or someone else what had happened after she was dragged away. She didn't see what happened. I saw everything. My mother didn't see, and Electra wasn't there at all. I was the only one, except for the people in the crowd and my father. Do you want to go home to your mother and Electra? Sometimes I don't, but maybe I do now. We have to decide. We'll go, and we'll take the dog. We'll have to make the dog trust us, or will follow us, Leander said. We'll get food to bring with us. We should take what food we can, and water. And what happens then, of course, is the homecoming, is the idea of them walking back after all the years. And of course, Leander walks back to find that his family has been waiting for him. And what his grandfather is missing, all the others are there. And however, Orestes moves back into the palace, where he finds his mother and her lover and his sister Electra in a rage against all of them, and all of them using him as the pawn, as the one who's most easily influenced. And as I worked on this, as I thought about it, it seemed closer and closer to Hamlet. That, in other words, I could see the shadow of Shakespeare, where he really, this story of a young man whose father has been murdered and whose mother has taken a lover, made its way into the creation of Hamlet. And I became interested in this idea of, then once that occurred to me, the idea of using a ghost again, of letting a ghost into a text. It's, again, a difficult thing to do in a novel, noticed in Jane Austen. We don't, it isn't as though that night as she went to sleep, the ghost of her old granny appeared. You just don't get, you get some, in Henry James, even in some of the Turn of the Screw, but in general, in a modern novel, you just have people, and they're alive in the world. And, obviously you have ghost stories, but in actual contemporary novels in general, ghosts, the appearance of ghosts is something every novelist lives in fear of. If I was teaching creative writing to you now, I'd say, don't do ghosts. We're no ghosts. We're no ghosts this semester. Could you just give me what people decided to do, what they did, and what happened as a result of that? That's enough for you this semester. Don't be trying this ghost business. But what happens eventually is that Orestes does murder his mother. And the problem I had in a way was, how do you write the next sentence? What do you do then? He murdered his mother, and then what did he do? He went back to his room, or he sat on his own. I just couldn't think, I'm not gonna, I know this is the wrong way to put it, but I'm going to try it. What would you do? What would I do? Well, we wouldn't, it's unimaginable what you would do. I just couldn't think. I scrolled down, as it were. I couldn't think of anything he could do. Would he eat his dinner? Would he find his sister? What would he do? And then I realized that no, this novel is waiting for something else. And so he murders his mother, and she dies, and you turn the page, and her name appears again. It appears like this, so you realize who it is who's talking. It's his mother. And I'm going to end the reading with this sequence, which, as I say, I stole from Shakespeare. Thank you. I stole from this idea of Hamlet's father's ghost appearing at the beginning. He doesn't say very much in Hamlet. I thought I'd get Clytemnestra to say a bit more. There will come a time when the shadows fold in on me. I know that. But I'm awake now, or almost awake. I remember some things, outlines come to me, and the faint sound of voices. What linger most are traces of people, presences, sounds. Mostly I walk among the shades, but sometimes a hint of someone comes close, someone whose name I once knew, or whose voice and face were real to me. Someone I loved, perhaps. I'm not sure. There's one remnant that comes and persists, however. It is my mother. And of course, her mother is Leda. So the whole myth of Leda and the swan has a sort of shadow undercurrent in this too. There's one remnant that comes and persists, however. It is my mother at some moment in the distant past. She is helpless, being held down. I can hear cries, her cries, and the shriller cries of a figure above her, or lying on her, and then louder cries as the figure flits away, a figure with a beak and wings, with the shape of wings, the wings beating in the air, and my mother lying breathless, whimpering. But I do not know what this means, or why it comes to me. I feel that if I remain still, something more will come. It is hard not to wander in these spaces when there is silence. There are presences I wish to encounter, presences that are close, but not close enough to touch or be seen. I cannot think of the names. Their names. I cannot see faces clearly, although there are moments when I have been quiet, when I have made no effort for some time to remember or focus. Moments when a face approaches, the face of someone I have known, but it fades before it becomes anyone I can recognize. I know that there was feeling, and that is the difference between where I am now and the place I was once. There was a time, I know, when I felt rage and I felt sorrow. But now I have lost what leads to rage and sorrow. Maybe the only reason I wander in these spaces has to do with some other feeling, or what is left of it. Maybe that feeling is love. There is someone whom I love still, or have loved and protected, but I cannot be sure of that. No name will come. Some words come, but not the words I want, which are the names. If I can say the names, I will know them. Then whom I loved, and I will find them, or know how to see them. I will lure them into the shadows when the time is right. No one in their world knows how little there is here. It is all blankness, strangeness, silence. Hardly anything moves. There are echoes like distant water flowing under rock, and then sometimes that sound comes nearer, but it is still faint. If I listen too eagerly, it disappears. Maybe there are things that did not come to an end when I was there, and they linger now like words that need to be said, or words that have escaped me and will come, or might come, or must come as I wait here. It will take time. I do not know how much time I have or how much time there is, but I know that I must fade, that I cannot persist in this state. The fading will be gradual. By the end, I will not know anything. What I'm hoping for is one more surge, some hours or even moments when I will go back into the world and settle into it briefly, as though I were alive. In the meantime, there is memory, which connects and attaches and withdraws. It is almost something. A vague thought hovers but is never stable. Like a figure with wings, it edges towards what has been or was. I live on the inside of what has substance. I can feel some large set of pressing desires brushing past. All I am left with, though, are the grey traces, the clues. This must be what shadow is like, or aftermath, some lines or shapes that must have made sense at one time, or may still make sense but seem random now. If only I could follow what their intention was, or whisper to whoever made them. That desire is the closest I have come to pure feeling, and it is not close at all. I would be left here for the hours or days or years I have been allotted, no longer than that. Being perplexed and bewildered replaces truth and knowledge, replaces what is real and tangible. The space I inhabit is like a sad gift that was offered but will soon be withdrawn. And then a word occurred to me. A word of which I was sure. It was the word dream. Once the word came, I knew what dream was or had been, and I was certain then that I was not dreaming in this nullness, that none of what is happening is dream. It is real, it is actual. And then other words appeared like stars in the darkening sky. I became desperate to take possession of each one, but I could not hold on to them. They were falling or glittering or moving further away. It was enough, however, to have seen them, to get some idea of their power and know that some of them would return, and like the light from a full moon on a dark night, become part of a shadowy stability that was guiding me. I walked in the corridors of that palace where I had once lived. I could almost remember some things that had happened. There was an image of someone in a garden or on steps that led to a garden, staring hard, breathing hard, but then nothing, just stillness in the garden, and then there was not even a garden, there was merely a space. But I was still awake. I was waiting, knowing that there would be change, that it would not always be like this. I was aware how easy it would be once I was in those corridors again for one of the guards to notice me if I made a sound or if I moved quickly, so that there would be some disturbance in the air. And then slowly I began to understand why I was here and who I was looking for. His name did not come to me, and I was not able to picture his face, but I felt that he was close. I could imagine the guard who had seen me or who had noticed my presence consulting one of the other guards, and then both of them approaching him, the one I am searching for, or his friend who looks after him. My husband is dead, and my daughter. They have become pure shade. My other daughter is here, but the one I am searching for is my son. I'm awake. The words I knew are sleeping. Sometimes they turn in the night or make some sound in their vast dreaming, and then they wake too. Often, if only for a second, they open their eyes and watch me. I hold their gaze so that they might remember me as they fall back into sleep. I study them then in their inert state. I'm alert to any movement they make. I can hear their dark groanings in the night, intermittent against their breathing. I can see them reach their arms towards me to be lifted. I can tell the difference between night and day now. I know the silence that descends on the gardens and the corridors at night, a silence broken only by the soft movement of the guards or of cats. This is my realm, where I'm free to wander. As I come from the garden, I'm aware that the guards can feel a movement in the air. We just take one more thing to let them know that I'm with them, a sound, a darting gesture. When the time came, I knew that I would hear his name, my son's name, enough to whisper it like someone imploring. It would come to me when I needed it. Orestes, I whispered on one of those nights, and then I withdrew into the shadows. Orestes. I repeated, letting my voice echo down the corridor. I saw two of the guards running back and forth, and then summoning the other one, my son's friend, who strutted up and down, checking doorways and corners. I waited until he had gone, and then I whispered to one of the guards, "Tell Orestes that I'm his mother. He must come alone into the corridor. He must be alone." The guard made as though to run, but stopped himself. "Speak again," he said quietly, his head bowed. "Tell Orestes to come alone," I said. "Now?" he asked. "Soon. Orestes must come soon." "Do you mean to cause him harm?" "No, I do not mean to cause him harm." Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Colm, as we've heard, the extraordinary new novel is called House of Names. But let's begin with your own name. Quick Irish lesson: the accents over Colm's last name are called fathers. And my understanding is that when you were starting out with your first novel, The South, you had to fight for those fathers.
I know, just at the English publisher, he was very nice. It's very left-wing, and he left them off by mistake. And then he pointed out to me how much money it would cost to do them all again, because it's one of those books where he put my name on the left-hand side of every left-hand page, which really is unnecessary. And he said the cost, and I said to him, well, look, it's taken us 700 years to fight for the right to have those things on our names, and you just put them back on you. And it was funny, that lovely relationship between Ireland and England now can be so ironic and funny. He looked at me almost frightened for a second, as though I was going to somehow declare war on him and his entire country over these tiny little marks that were on my name.
Good man yourself. I think that was a great
And
victory.
as a result, we got Brexit.
Well, talking of the relationship, the complicated relationship between Ireland and England, growing up in Enniscorthy, that already is an education in Irish history, growing up in that town.
Yeah, I was brought up on a battlefield that in 1798, there was a rebellion in County Wexford, which is the corner county, the southeast of Ireland. And for some time, the rebels actually held the town. And in certain ways, 1798 happened in a way also in 1898, which was the real rise of Irish nationalism leading to Irish independence, where a great number of the famous ballads that we all learned in school and we all sang were written in 1898, including songs about my town, Enniscorthy, and the hill which we could see directly from our house was Vinegar Hill, and Vinegar Hill was where the last battle was fought. And so the famous song Bull of Og were at Vinegar Hill or the Pleasant Slaney. Our heroes vainly stood back to back, and the Yos at Tullow took Father Murphy and burned his body upon the rack. And when my father and a friend of his who was a priest started a museum in the town, people came into the museum. This would be in about 1961, so when I was 6. And they literally had still the tops of the pikes that were used by the rebels, whereas the English had cannons and muskets, the rebels had pikes. And the people had held on to these things or had discovered them in hiding places. And they gave them to the museum. So this was actually a living thing, where at one point I was in the room and my father was directing a sort of painter to draw the map with arrows of where the rebels went. And this was much more interesting in a way than a lot of things were happening on television. This was our story. And then I was 11 in 1966, which was the 50th anniversary of the 1916 rebellion. And my grandfather took part in the rebellion and was interned by the British in Wales after the rebellion. I mean, this story often sounds simple, but it's always filled with ironies and strangenesses. Where the Enniscorthy, where I'm from, was English speaking for quite a few hundred years. So when the Irish rebels, who wanted an Irish speaking independent Ireland, but they were speaking English to each other, went to Wales where they were being interned and held. Their guards, who were meant to be British, were speaking Welsh. But the prisoners were speaking English, and that was just another example of the sort of irony surrounding this. But certainly that idea of my grandfather, and he's being in prison and he's being released, and so all of those things were very, very close, and were very much part of ordinary life.
And it's not just the town of Enniscorthy, but when I think about your Irish novels set down in what we call, with some optimism, the sunny southeast. Sometimes we have a good summer down there. It's the sunny southeast. Not just the town, but I think even more so that eroding Wexford coastline seems to be the very center of your imagination. You return to that wonderful coastline with places like Cush and Blackwater and Curracloe and Ballyconagher. It's almost as if many of your readers have never been there, they wouldn't need a GPS app on their phone when they eventually do go on the Tóibín tour of the sunny southeast. That is a magical place for you, that coastline.
Yeah, what I'm talking about before is I suppose the political hinterland, and that's always there. But often a political hinterland doesn't really matter as much as a personal hinterland. And my father was a teacher, and that meant that we had longer holidays than everybody else. You could rent huts and caravans and little houses really cheaply on that coast. And even though we were only 10 miles from the coast, we would go there for the summer. And we were called, the locals who would have nothing to do with the sea, they really, the idea of swimming for pleasure, was really something that really puzzled them and baffled them. But they called us the bathers because people went into the sea, the cold Irish Sea, willingly, as though for pleasure. And but what happened was that we went there, and then when my father died, I was 12, and we didn't go anymore. And so years later, when I was writing my first novel, and I needed to bring the characters back from Spain, where they were, to Ireland, I couldn't think where to bring them. It was going to be Dublin, or it was going to be, it could have been anywhere. It suddenly struck me that I could bring them back to that landscape, to that stretch of coast, that, as you say, Cush, Ballyconagher, down to Curracloe. And once I did that, I realised that landscape meant a great deal to me, that I had lost it, fully lost it. And that one way I could recover it was by writing it, was by describing it in detail. This is the Irish Sea. It's not the big Atlantic. It's not the wild, rocky Atlantic. It's a much calmer, gentler sea. And in a way, the manners of the people match that. And the strange other part of it is that the cliffs erode. And this is before global warming. Before this whole idea of now that we have of the sea moving in on land. This was happening there because the cliffs were made of marl, M-A-R-L, and it was soft. And my father's first cousin, Dick Whelan, who was my godfather, he had a house on the edge of the cliff, and he'd retired early. I think just so he could, have an easy, quiet life, looking at the waves and thinking about nothing else much. And then, of course, the sea began to move towards him. And you can still see the back wall of that house, but the house fell over. And it still happens that, I've been in America for a while, and I'd go back, and I would go down there, and someone would say something, and I'd realize another house had fallen in. And it's capricious. It moves in some desperately towards one house, leaving another one further down alone. It is as though the gods have been good to somebody and not to somebody else. But of course, I was interested in it first, not necessarily as metaphor, that it didn't symbolize anything. It was just itself, the strangest thing when you're a child that could happen in a landscape, that there was once a road going right around there, and now that road is completely gone. There was once a hill, even postcards were of that hill. There's no hill now. And just that idea, just to start with, just forgetting about its resonance or its implications, was something I thought I could write about and use, that it stood, look, no matter what you did with it, it stood for time. It stood for the way that, time gets eaten and moves on. And it's still happening.
And probably maybe the most evocative novel of that coastline is your fourth novel, The Blackwater Lightship, which is this wonderful, it is a thing itself, and it is a thing that's gone away, but it also serves as this metaphor for something invisible, some very palpable absence. And it strikes me that in reading a lot of your other novels set in Ireland or other places, other shores, there's often a kind of Blackwater lightship. There's often a sense of a light having been extinguished.
Yeah, I suppose that idea that happens here for Orestes of his father not being there, and of him sort of being away from home in a sort of funny exile, so that even when he returns, it's never good enough. You can never get it all back again. And I suppose that idea is essentially our fate in the world, that we cannot get things back again, that time will not relent. And that is also a very dramatic idea, that as you're going through each moment, you think, well, you don't start regretting it. But then, once you do, that regret is filled with certain things you would give anything to get back. Certain things don't matter. And then what the things that matter are, what matters to us, become something that we oddly, as time moves on, cannot recover except in memory, and of course in language, perhaps in art, but in language where you could actually seriously evoke a certain day that occurred in the past, in a certain place, when there were people there who are not there anymore, when the light was the same, the sky was the same, but other things were different. And you can write that down, and that might mean something to other people as much as to you. You could actually communicate that feeling of a particular lost thing by trying to render it exactly down to the smallest detail and see what could come of that, see what resonance that would have, not just for you as the writer, but for the reader.
Yeah, it strikes me there's a beautiful chapter in The Master, your fifth novel, about Henry James, where he's brooding about his sister's unquiet ghost. So it seems as if there are many hauntings.
Dear, I'd forgotten I put that in.
Yeah. It seems that there are hauntings in many of your novels, whether they're set in Greece or Ireland or Argentina.
Yeah, I think when the novel The Master opens, it's 1895, and Henry James is living in the great aftermath almost of his family. He's not exactly being haunted by his brother William, who's still alive. He's being bullied by him with letters across the Atlantic, and he's still as in Orestes, he's still the younger brother being told what to do by his older brother. But his sister Alice is dead, and his parents are dead, and his Aunt Kate is dead. He is. There's a moment where his sister-in-law says to him, "You'll be the last of the five. He'll be the last to survive," meaning that he will witness or he will be alive for the death of his two younger brothers as well. And so he's living in this time when that sort of regret is there, which I think has made its way into some books of his, including Portrait of a Lady, for example, with the figure of Ralph Touchett. But that therefore he actually sets about building a world that cannot be destroyed. So he puts such huge energy, having written haunting books like The Turn of the Screw. In one great 3-year period, he writes The Ambassadors, The Wings of the Dove, The Golden Bowl, 3 great monuments in a way that will withstand time, the time that has been eating away at certain things that matter to him. And he too, because he's living in Rye in the south of England, the coast there is doing the opposite thing, where the coast has actually increased, but there has been a change in the landscape too. I couldn't believe my luck when I came across this, because it did happen around Rye, where Rye actually was on the sea, but actually because of alluvial soil, had actually that the land had actually increased. So I thought that whole idea of a changing landscape, of something that wasn't the same as it used to be, had resonance, or something that I could work with.
Well, that's James's fictional world. Let's talk about Colm Tóibín's fictional world. And I came across a few months ago when I was teaching a class in Ireland here at University of Houston, I came across a quote from the great Irish essayist Hubert Butler from Kilkenny, who said that, and I think when he says essays, we might substitute the word novel or story. He said, even when these essays appear to be about Russia or Greece or Spain or Yugoslavia, they are really about Ireland. And in fact, you have written about Greece and you have written about Spain and you have written about other countries like Argentina. Are you, in a sense, always writing about Ireland even when your imagination is so far-ranging?
I think that's partly true, where the first book I wrote is a book called Bad Blood, where I walked along the Irish border. I walked along the Irish border in 1986. I walked west-east, and it was a bad year. There was a lot of violence, and people were really living in fear. And people kept saying to me, "Are you not afraid?" And I said, "No, because people are much more afraid of me. Because who is this fellow walking along, this funny look on his face, and especially in the very empty countryside." And the only explanation you could give was the truth. I'm writing a book. And once you said that, people, "Oh, writing a book, that seems reasonable." Because anything else was really frightening. And the problem was that and it's something you probably know coming from Dublin, where even though we lived through the troubles in Northern Ireland, in the south of Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, as though it was our country, it was also distant from us. It was on television. It wasn't as though any of us were personally involved in it. We didn't know anyone who were killed. It somehow was strangely
It was
not
100
there.
miles away and 1,000 miles away.
100 miles away and 1,000 miles away. And it seemed also 500 years away in some of the tribal hatreds. And so I decided I should really find out about it. And so I set out walking. And I was a real outsider there. I'm more outsider than maybe if I'd come from here. Because people just thought, well, oh, you come from Wexford. That's, no one had been in Wexford who I met. But because I had, whatever way I pretended I was just innocent and knew nothing and I needed as much information as possible. And I would knock on anyone's door. And some people were really uneasy about, because I was a Catholic, or so-called Catholic, from the Republic, or so-called Republic. Anyway, but, I ended up, especially towards the end of the book, finding myself in a number of places where people literally took me into their house and told me what had happened to them. And some of those stories were so frightening, which had to do with the spiral of violence, which had to do not merely with a set of killings that happened once in one place, but were done in retaliation for something else. Things were done in retaliation for them. Nothing was isolated. It was as though once the genie had been let out, once the energy had started, the energy around violence, once it had begun, it couldn't be contained again.
It's in this book with Augustus in particular, isn't it?
Yes, and I find this, when going back to talking about the heroism of 1798 in Vinegar Hill, that when you start reading closely what happened, actually those killing, it wasn't merely a nationalist rebellion. A lot of people were killed, and once the killing began, it couldn't be stopped. And while it was in the name of Ireland, sometimes it was in the name of just some hunger for violence that people developed. And so that idea of which we would see in a civil war, say in somewhere like Syria or the former Yugoslavia, neighbour against neighbour, or a city divided in two, that certainly began to interest me, with a Belfast that divided in two, or even the city of Derry divided in two, or even County Fermanagh, but parts of Ireland divided into two. And that division spilling over into violence, and that violence that no one could contain. That idea has stayed with me as something that I think we have to face, all of us, and explore. That once it starts, it's hard to stop. And I think, as we know from, for example, Iraq or Libya at the moment, and indeed Syria, and indeed if you look, for example, at the American Civil War, for example. And so I needed a story, and here was the story. It was the oldest one, and it was there waiting in a way for me, because the emotions were close to me. The whole idea of family, the whole idea of country at war, and the whole idea of violence as something that cannot be contained. And also the idea of myself as a sort of funny little Orestes wandering around, slightly shell-shocked in the world. I mean, I'm never sure about anything, and I'm easy to persuade about anything. I always lose arguments, you know, and everyone I know seems to know something certain, and I never do. And I suppose in a way that's what writing novels is about, trying to see everyone's point of view. But it doesn't help you in your life, you know. I mean, it really doesn't, you know. And so a lot of things that mattered to me went into the book.
Maybe this novel has been in the works for quite some time. One of your nonfiction books is called New Ways to Kill Your Mother, and this seems to be very old ways to kill your mother. But also I was looking back at an essay you did for The Guardian a few years ago when Nora Webster came out, and then you were reading closely and deeply into Anne Carson's translations of the Greek tragedians. And you said, and you were looking particularly at the relationship between this rage and this violence and the grief that's there underneath. You're very interested in the subject of grief. You say in that novel that trickery is the very currency of grief. And a word I've noticed that you keep on coming back to is the word unmooring. There is an unmooring that happens when people are in grief.
You see, what happened was that when I was 12, my father died, and myself and my younger brother were in the house then on our own with our mother. And we had to carry on. We had to go back to school. She had to find a job. And I began to watch her. I began to watch her really, really carefully. And there's a moment in Nora Webster where Nora Webster thinks about her son, who's very much this boy here. He has been watching me more closely than I've been watching him, she thinks. And I think that was partly true, in that my mother was very concerned about us being safe and well and looked after. But how do you deal? No one has ever worked out to this day how you deal with children and grief, how you deal with loss in children. It's not as though, I mean, despite all the work psychiatrists and psychologists have done and counselors, there's no one knows whether you should talk about it all the time, whether you should leave silence, whether you should leave kids alone, whether you should worry about what's really going on in their minds, whether you should think they'll be all right. Children always heal themselves. And so we lived in that state of unknowing. And that made its way into Nora Webster. And when the novel was written, I had to sort of think about it as to other books. I mean, for example, Anne Carson's translations of the Greek text, Joan Didion's book,
The Year of Magical
Thinking and Blue Nights. And I had actually, when Vanessa Redgrave played that in Dublin, I had actually interviewed her on the stage. So I was really alert to her, and I had known Joan Didion. And so Julian Barnes's book about the death of his wife, whom I'd also known, there's a wonderful book called A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis. So I just, there's Joyce Carol Oates' book, it's a wonderful book called A Widow's Story. And all of them were saying things that I knew from experience as being true. The distance between what you're feeling and what you're saying, the sort of silences that really become both poisonous and nourishing. I mean poisonous in that by not letting the feelings out and be expressed, something is festering inside you. And nourishing in that you do have to continue. You cannot just dwell on this all the time. And so, therefore, all of that stayed in me, enough so that with the novel Nora Webster, I could try and deal with it. And the unmooring part is that business of watching my mother for the first time after my father died, say 6 months or into a year, going out for the first time, you know, where a friend of hers said, you must come out. And her dressing up to go out, but realizing that she would be coming home without him and that she wouldn't know what to do when she was out because she would always have been with him. And I would have, oddly enough, as a little novelists are dangerous little fellows, as a little sort of 12-year-old or 13-year-old, I would have seen all of that and known it without being told it, without having her say it. And it stayed in my mind, that idea of someone being unmoored, of the anchor being lifted, and the sea being stormy or calm, and you can never judge which day it's going to be.
It's a beautiful book because it's so unusual, I think, Nora Webster. It's a Bildungsroman of the second half of life. We rarely get that, and it's also about the second half of a woman's life. That's rare from a male novelist's point of view. And one of the ways in which Nora gets a new life is that she gets a musical life.
Yeah.
And I know music is very important to you, and you've written beautifully and accurately about music in your books. There's a scene early in the Blackwater Lightship when the people are watching the master, the Uillón Piper, and you say they listened, full of respect and deep interest in the technique, the sense of control and release. I think that's very similar to the way that you operate too, and you capture this sense of grief. There is silence and speech, and I think the tension between those seems to be terribly important in your work.
Yeah, but I think that's true, but also in a novel you have to be careful that the novel is not merely thematic. In other words, that if you want to write a pamphlet about grief or a self-help book, there are many publishers, really want those books. And but with a novel you have to be very careful that you allow in the full texture of life, that the ordinary business of the day gets in also, as part of the water she has to navigate. So the idea, what happened in those few years, I'm talking about 68, 69, 70 in Ireland, was that the widow's pension increased. Quite a serious increase. And I remember the news. My mother had more money than she thought she was going to have. And one day, she went downtown and there was a stereo record player, which would have been a huge thing for us to have, appeared in the house. And then records began to come. And my father and his brother thought classical music was just ridiculous. All those screeching and all that stuff, turned that off, And I realized my mother had all the years loved it, but never played. It was something she just, when she married. I think all of us in our love life have to really worry, does the person you love, do they love the same music as you? And if not, are you going to put up with that? Do you love them so much that you'll allow them to play the Rolling Stones or something? When you absolutely long for Bach's Mass in B minor, and they're playing the Rolling Stones. That's called love, if you tolerate that. And so that therefore, this music began to come. And in the town, there was, I suppose like a book club now, there was a gramophone society, where in the local hotel, someone would bring in a record player, a stereo, carry it in, plug it in, set it up, and it would be one person's choice every week to bring in their records. Records were expensive, and people didn't have many of them, so this was a way you could hear new music. And my mother, of course, would come home and tell us all, so just that's against the story of grief. She would come home and tell us all about all the people in the Gramophone Society. Now, luckily, by the time I wrote the book, they had all passed on to their reward, to the great symphony in the sky. And but there was a priest, and he really loved sopranos and contraltos and mezzos, and he talked about them like he knew them and lived with them. So he would talk about Joan, and he would mean Joan Sutherland, or Kathleen, he'd mean Kathleen Ferrier. And my mother and her friend thought this was an unseemly way for a priest to talk. That he was meant to be celibate. And of course he was, entirely celibate. But he had this wonderful dream life with these wonderful singers. Rita, he'd say, Rita. Oh, I was listening to Rita the other night. It'd be Rita Strike, the great Viennese singer. And there was one woman, also gone to her reward, who, if there was symphonic music on, she would conduct. And they'd drive the others nuts because it just could, she would distract them from listening. My mother would come home and say, I wish she would stop. And so, there were many things, within that business of loss comes the business of ordinary life coming back and sort of almost attempting to restore itself against sort of trying to push on the closed door of the self to see if it will open and if other things can happen. So in the novel, I mean, it happens in House of Names too, where there's an attempt sometimes where Clytemnestra, wants her son to have the best room, and is his room comfortable? Is it too warm? Is it too hot? That is an attempt. It's not so successful in this Greek novel, I have to say, because they really don't do it very well. But in the life I'm trying to describe in Nora Webster, it does come back more. She does find a life for herself.
Now, Colm, I'm sure there are quite a few Brooklynites here this evening, and that by that I mean the people who discovered your work through your breakthrough novel, Brooklyn, a few years ago. It was an international success, as was the movie. So I thought I'd ask you a little bit about that. Henry James, a very different experience. Your movie was a great success, and Henry James and the Master, his play is a bit of a disaster. But as he's watching the rehearsals, you say he was both thrilled and disturbed by the idea that only half the work was his. The other half belonged to the director, the actors, and the scene makers. Now, you wrote that about 10 years before you saw your book adapted for the screen, but did you have any reason to recall that, the thrill and the disturbance of seeing the work being transformed like that?
One of the problems is that you really worry once the possibility of a film being made of a book starts, is that it won't be made, that the night before they're due to film it, they'll stop. It's never certain. And the idea, when it came up, that the young Irish actress Saoirse Ronan was going to do this was really amazing. That she had not done an Irish film before. She had played, Atonement, she played The Lovely Bones, The Grand Hotel Budapest. She played many characters from many countries, but no Irish character. And she was at exactly the right age. And therefore the idea of her doing this, and also because one thing they want is the novelist to go away, really. And in order to do that, so the director had lunch with me, and I knew that really I could ask for one thing, but not two. And also the lunch should be reasonably brief, because he was busy,
And he's from Cork, which makes it very different.
And so what I said was, there was one singer I wanted, a singer called Iarla Linord, who I thought was a great Irish singer. If he could sing the song, that would really be all I wanted. But what I really wanted was the Irish sequences of the film to be shot in Enniscorthy, where I'm from. It just would have satisfied something in me where, I knew these streets, my parents knew these streets, I had written about them in the novel. Imagine if they filmed them, and then that would be done. And I didn't ask, because I thought, if I ask, he'll tell me, no, we've gone and looked, and there are too many new aerials, or there's neon or something, and it won't work. But he went down there and he looked, and he made the film. He made the Irish sequences in Enniscorthy, so that when the film was shown in Enniscorthy, and I have to say that it was more glamorous than Oscar night. We actually our red carpet was redder, and we looked better, and our clothes were much more glamorous than all of those people in Hollywood for the 2 screenings of Brooklyn in Enniscorthy. But when the film opened, when they just started, and she came out a door, and everyone realized, my God, that's John Street. And then as she walked along and went, that's Friary, she's going along Lower Church Street, oh my God. And then the extras, of course, were watching themselves, and the relatives were all there. Yeah. And so it was a very special night. There was no downside. There was a trepidation, that maybe, that if people didn't like it. And then there was one change made, which was the ending is much more explicit in the film than it is in the novel. And that's the part, I've seen the film about 5 times, that's the part that makes me cry, the part I didn't write. Moves me. And that's the strangest idea. With all the rest, I'm sort of watching it technically to see, and then the part Nick Hornby added, really, oh my God, I wish, and anyway, that's what makes me cry.
You reminded me something, talking about that community spirit there in Enniscorthy. The redoubtable Sister Thomas in Nora Webster, who's a very feisty character, says something extraordinary to Nora. in her widowhood. She says, "It is a small town and it will guard you." And I think she means that to be reassuring, but that can also be quite sinister. It is a small town and it will guard you. And I was just thinking to myself, there are guards everywhere in the new novel. People are always being guarded in every sense of the word in your novels. Where do you think this comes from?
Well, I think what I meant there was that I was also trying to work against a cliche, which was that the Irish small town was getting a bad press.
Yeah.
Where people would think they were the valley of the squinting windows. You know, the whole idea of nobody can be themselves because they'll be stopped by a priest, by a nun, or by, you know, a policeman, and everyone is being squashed and squeezed, and people are having a horrible time. And it just didn't seem true to me, but also, whether that was the case or not, it didn't also seem right to me for fiction. Just be careful about joining the club on any set of, you know, of accepted values or accepted ideas. So I thought, let the nuns say that to her as a comforting thing. It's a small town and it will guard you. And guard there I meant as something good, that you will never, you know, that if you didn't take in your milk bottle one day, someone would notice and come and see that you were okay. I mean, I did mean that in a reasonably benign way. Yeah. But the guards, there's no moment in this where there isn't somebody watching, whispering, listening. And Orestes thinks he's listening to his sister, but in fact, you know, she knows he's listening. Each guard is duplicitous. You can trust nobody, and everybody is watching. And the only person who really doesn't notice everything is Orestes himself, who's often just misses the point of something, but the guards are along the corridor through the night, and the guards will follow anybody, and the guards will remember everything. So yeah, there's absolutely that sense of a surveillance of that sort of, you know, there are not CCTV cameras as much as people, but they're doing the same thing. It will be recorded.
So that house of names, the palace of the house of Atreus, is a very sinister place in the novel. But there's another house of names in the novel, which you alluded to in the reading. And by the way, you have to go through this extraordinary, almost Cormac McCarthy-like
good old Cormac, he was great
phase.
Help. Thank you. If he's in the audience, thank you, Cormac.
Yeah. I didn't think I'd be reading scenes like this in a Colm Tóibín novel. It is an extraordinary... it is an extraordinary sequence in the novel, the Orestes sequence. But when they get to this old woman's house, the house by the sea, in a sense this turns out to be the true house of names. That's where the title comes in. And it is a house of storytelling. And you have this wonderful blend between Homer. She is the kind of Homer figure in the novel, the unnamed old woman. But I notice you also sneak in the children of Lear and Cuchulainn, and there are some Irish myths in operation there. Why was that, through this kind of bleak Cormac McCarthy-like landscape, why was that one of your ultimate destinations in the novel?
What I wanted was him to arrive at a place which was almost a dream place, which was a haven, which was a place at the edge of the sea where he and his two friends would be safe. And so that I began, the first thing that happens is they kill a dog in a way which is absolutely from Irish mythology. It's from the Táin, it's from the story of Cuchulainn. And what they say to her is exactly what Cuchulainn will say when he kills the dog. You have no one to guard you now, I will guard you. And so they arrive. And then, of course, I had to then work out who is the woman. She's almost somebody from folk tale. And they're in as I say, in a sort of haven. And the idea of swans, of course, Leda and the Swan, and that rape giving way, causing the birth of Helen of Troy, and also Leda being the mother of Clytemnestra. And the story of Helen of Troy, even though it's all happened recently, has come to this remote place on the wind as a fragmented story already, almost as a folk tale being told. There was a beautiful woman and everybody wanted to marry her, as though somehow that is the way things happen, where they happen and then soon they move into the area of twice-told tales or of mythology. And then once I had the swan, that there was a swan, and the swan, was the father, as it were, of this beautiful woman. The other story of swans came to me, which is a story that we would know in Ireland from childhood, and that had survived in the oral tradition in Ireland, had survived in written form, and is the most beautiful story I think we have, is the story of the children of Lir. And of course, Orestes is away from home. He's been banished, as it were, and it's the story of three children who their ugly stepmother is, all the material is there, who are turned into swans and sent away for 900 years. And the only thing they ask for is a golden chain between them so they will never be separated. And then after 900 years, they return. And of course, once they land again from the place from whence they came, they will return to being mortals. And when the wings will fall off the beaks, they will become people. And then in that way, as in Shangri-La, as in Lost Horizon, they will become 900 years old. And so that I couldn't resist this other story of the swan, as though it had blown in from Ireland into Greece.
Yeah, you're adding the fathers in there.
As though the fathers were being added. That an Irish story had blown in from Greece, as a Greek story had blown in towards me in Ireland, and that whole idea of there being a central repository of stories, and some countries get versions of one and others versions of the other. I just wanted to mix that together. So I'm delighted you noticed it, because I almost wanted to put a note to the reader saying, please check this story. I mean, it comes from Ireland. But now that you've done that, I don't have to worry.
Colum, I could talk for another hour, but the gods are telling me that the book signing must begin. So we just want to thank you so much for coming to Houston, and we hope you're back again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.